Okay, so let's jump right into the topic and let's talk about employee versus contractor. So the first thing to keep in mind is, and I want you to put the hat of a person that just got hired, quote unquote, and that's an important concept, right? Got hired, quote unquote, to do a job, and that job for that week or whatever, it's $1,000. If you're a person that just got hired to do a job, and let's assume that you're in a 15% federal tax bracket and you get FICA withholding, that $1,000 is really going to turn into a $773.50 paycheck. Okay, so we went from $1,000 all the way to 773. So the employee, most people are used to getting tax withholding, so that's not a big deal. But that's the number they have in their head, and that's also assuming that there's no state income tax and no additional deductions like health insurance and retirement plans and stuff like that, versus getting a straight check for $1,000. So think about putting yourself in the shoes of someone that is given the choice, where somebody says, do you want to be an employee or do you want to be a subcontractor? By the way, I'm asking the questions the way some people do, but this is not correct. This is not something you can ask and make a choice right on the spot. We're going to talk about the rules and what makes somebody an employee and a subcontractor. But imagine if you're a small business and you give the person the choice, and in front of them, they have the difference between a $700 check and a $1,000 check. What do you think they're going to, quote unquote, choose? So this is a big issue. The big issue is that a lot of small businesses think that this is up to them to choose. And then when they're given the choice, obviously every single person is going to want the larger check. Now, how do you figure out tax withholding? So assuming that you're not in depth with payroll, if you're not really, really in depth working with payroll, the best thing for you to do is go to publication 15A. You can literally just Google that. And if you go to publication 15A, there are tax tables that tell you how much tax you should withhold. Now, there are general tax tables like the ones you're seeing here that are more for a sort of annualized type of income. So that lets you know which tax bracket the employee is going to be. However, based on paycheck to paycheck, is much better to use the tax table. So I'm going to open that up real quick just to give you some context here. So here's my publication 15A, okay? And if I go all the way down, you're going to see something that is called the tax table. So basically, if you're a semi-monthly payroll and you have 2 allowances and you are married and you make whatever per paycheck $2,000, this will tell you exactly how much you need to withhold. So that's kind of the concept behind withholding. Now, most tax software takes care of that, and in a payroll processing software or payroll software like QuickBooks Payroll, whatever, they take care of that. So you don't have to make those manual calculations, but it's really important to know where that information comes from, because every new employee, if they're given, let's call it a choice, okay, between being a contractor and an employee. By the way, this is not a choice you make. This has to do with, where the employee qualifies based on a whole bunch of rules. But if they're given the choice and they want to know how much the withholding is going to be, well, you have to add FICA, which is 7.65%, which is the one that I put there, plus the federal withholding, which is going to be based on that tax bracket. So that's pretty much how you figure that out all in all. Now, let's talk about from the company's perspective. What if I am an employer and I'm trying to determine whether I want to pay an employee a paycheck or I want to have a subcontractor instead? Well, think about the math here. The employer has to match FICA, which is Social Security and Medicare. So the employer is going to have $76 of tax they have to pay off those $1,000. And then they also have federal unemployment tax, state unemployment tax, and I'm not even mentioning state income tax if there's any. And some states have, employer paid additional taxes that have to do with sort of the burden of being an employer. So if you look at just FICA, FUTA, and SUTA, that's going to be a net payroll cost of $1,109 versus a net check of $1,000. Again, if the employer is trying to make the choice on whether I should pay someone as an employee or an independent contractor, what do you think the employer is going to choose? Again, this is not their choice, but again, if they have a choice, what do you think they're going to choose? This is the point. The really huge epidemic problem that we have in the United States, or at least the stuff that I see with a lot of my clients is they want to pay everyone as independent contractor. Why? Because you don't have to pay payroll taxes. You don't have to deal with the HR and all the other drama behind having employees, timesheets, you name it. And they just want to pay checks as contractors, and at the end give somebody a 1099 form. So let's break down the administrative burden just to give you some insight as of why an employer would misclassify an employee as a subcontractor or an independent contractor, sort of, let's call it on purpose, right? So first of all, as an employee, you have to collect multiple documents: I-9, W-4, state employment reporting forms. Some employers do background checks, things like that. So that would add to the cost. You have to collect timesheets. You have to calculate and control overtime. You have to issue a net paycheck, which requires you to calculate the paycheck. You have to remit taxes, report quarterly forms to the IRS and state, and issue W-2s. And that's a pretty big burden. And we haven't even talked about, benefits and workers' comp and all that stuff. As a contractor, it's really, really easy. All you do is collect one form, the W-9. You get the invoice from the subcontractors. You pay them their check. You don't have to deal with overtime. You don't have to deal with timesheets. You issue a regular check, and you report one form at the end of the year. So that makes it so anyone that's given the choice is probably going to choose subcontractor, but in some cases not correctly. Maria, do you want to add anything to this before we talk about the eligibility rules as for subcontractors?
Yeah, just something quickly. I think just to keep it really simple, I mean, for the accountants that are on here, tax preparers, and even small business owners, or those that are contractors themselves, I think ultimately it's just really important and an obligation truly to make sure that if you are categorizing from a small business perspective, if you're categorizing someone as a contractor versus employee, they've only been an employee their entire life, and then you turn them into a contractor, or they've been an employee, they started with you in a new job, and they become your contractor. Please be mindful that they may not understand anything we just said. They may not have any idea what it means to be a contractor, that they're going to get a 1099, that $1,000 check that Hector just showed you visually, used to be, $700 because withholdings were taken out. Now it's $1,000. What does that actually mean? That means they need to withhold, the Social Security, the 15.3%. They need to withhold income taxes for both federal and state, because unless you're in 3 or 4 states, 5 states, you definitely have to pay state taxes. So just be mindful of that. That's really important. I really feel it's our obligation as a citizen to let people know what they're getting themselves into. So that's really the most important thing that I want to note and interject here, is that be honest, be transparent, and make sure everybody that is on that boat, especially being a contractor, understands what that really means.
Yeah, that's a great point. We haven't gotten there yet, Maria, and we're going to discuss that. That $1,000 flat check that the contractor gets is not really $1,000, because there is going to be more self-employment taxes that they're going to have to pay. And we're going to discuss that a little bit later on as we talk about the burden of the self-employed individual. But we're talking about just the check itself, which is, the sort of the first interaction that the contractor or employee gets with the business. So let's go into how the IRS determines whether a contractor has been misclassified as an employee. So rule of thumb, if you're a business and you're paying someone for services, rule of thumb, you should default to employee. Okay, that's always the conservative approach. Again, that's the most expensive and the most burdensome, both administratively and with tax costs for the small business. But your conservative approach is to treat every single individual that works for you as an employee. However, we explain what the great benefits are of having an independent contractor instead of an employee, so we know why people would be encouraged to classify someone as a subcontractor. So let's talk about how the IRS determines this. And basically, this is a three-prong approach. It's behavioral control, financial control, and type of relationship. So think about those three. Generally speaking, behavioral control. Do you control what time the worker comes in, how they do their work, right? How they do their work, whether or not you train them specifically on how they have to do the work, okay? Do you control their schedule? Okay, do you give them tools? Do they use their own tools? So think about that. The more behavioral control you have, you give them tools, you control their work at your office, that sort of thing, that's going to be more towards employee. If you don't control what time they work, how to do the work, and they use their own tools, then that you have less behavioral control, therefore that moves more towards independent contractor. Okay, let's talk about financial control. Now, are they exclusive? So does that employee or contractor make all their money 100% from your business, or do they have other businesses that pay them? That's a really important one, because if they basically live off your business and it's been a year, 2 or 3 years, and their only source of income is your business, that looks like you have a lot of financial control over them. So that's a really important one. How they get paid, like if you specifically say, no, we're going to give you a direct deposit and it's going to be this day, it's going to be that day. So if you determine how they get paid rather than them giving you an invoice and giving you terms, or determine how the expenses are reimbursed, or who pays for materials, who pays for supplies, all that stuff matters. So think about it. If you pay for all materials, tools, and choose how they get paid and they get reimbursed, you got financial control. If they use their own materials, their own tools, they invoice you, right? And then they give you terms of payment, and there's a contract, and they have risk that you may not pay if they don't do the work correctly, then you have less financial control, and that moves more towards independent contractor. Okay? Now, the last one is type of relationship. So do you have a written contract? Really important, right? An independent contractor, it's a contractor, which means they work based on a contract. Really important. Is the contract permanent? Is it short term? So if you got short term contracts or one-time job type of contracts, that helps a lot. If you actually give benefits, give vacation pay, give bonuses on performance, all that stuff makes it much closer to it being an employee. Okay, so that's really important. It's the type of relationship, right? Okay, so those are the three sort of high level things you want to think about: behavioral, financial, and type of relationship. Now, there is a form called the SS8 form. This is an official form that any IRS agent will use to determine in an audit or maybe a proceeding in which they're trying to figure out if you have misclassified contractors. And this is the type of information they gather. So I'm going to pull up the SS8 form just so we can get an idea of what that looks like and to see exactly what is it that you will be dealing with. So there's about 57 questions. Things like, how do you obtain the job? Do you fill out an application? Did you bid an estimate? Right? And there are some things that are not simple answers. They're like, describe the business, the type of questions that the IRS will ask. Things like, where is the job actually performed? Some of these are just to describe it. Describe whether or not there's specific training, right? Is there a specific training? How do they get work assignments? Do they get work orders? Do they get, purchase orders? Things that look like a third-party relationship. What type of reports are they required? Do they give them performance reports? Do they give them daily reports? Do they just get invoices? All these questions, it's amazing. If you go to this form, it is amazing the amount of information that they gather. And by the way, this form at the end, unlike almost all the IRS forms, this one does not tell you at the end, this means based on your answers, they're a contractor or they're an employee. There will actually be a subjective approach, like an actual agent will read this whole thing, and based on this very subjective mind, using tax rules and stuff like that, they will determine whether the answers from this form moves it more towards employee or subcontractor. So I think it's extremely valuable for you to get familiar with that SS8 form. Now, there's another document that's actually a little bit older, but a lot of people like it. Where is my document here? Which is called, and you can download it from the handouts. Oops, not this one. Where is it? Sorry about that. Okay, let me. Yeah, it's on the handouts. Let me go ahead and copy and paste this up here. Now, this one is called the 20 factor test. This is an old document that that it was published by Senate and the IRS, and there was a whole bunch of people involved with this document. And this document is actually pretty neat. It's over 10 years old, but it goes through 20 factors that makes it much easier to understand. So this is actually an easier approach to the SS8 form, but it talks about instructions, training, integration, hiring, supervision, relationship, doing work in the premises, how they get paid. If you actually go through this 20 point system and read this 17-page document, I know it's not fun, but between that and the SS8 form, you should have enough tools to determine whether someone should be an employee or a subcontractor. Now, if you are a business that now after this webinar is realizing that maybe you misclassified your employees as subcontractors, or maybe you're an accounting professional and you're starting to detect that maybe they misclassified them, there's a form called the 8952, which is called the Voluntary Classification Settlement Program. So if you're worried that your misclassification is going to turn into an audit and just cause a huge mess in terms of penalties, back taxes, you can actually voluntarily reclassify your employees, and the amount of penalty is much lower. Okay, so let's kind of wrap this up. So if you're a small business and you have an employee, let's talk about some of the sort of pros and cons. So this is kind of the summary of that conversation before we move into the tax deductions. The companies will have the burden of paying payroll taxes. So we talked about that. And you also got unemployment taxes, and some states have special taxes. I know California has a training tax. Florida doesn't have that. Different states can have different taxes related to having employees. And most of those taxes go to fund unemployment programs, people that get hurt in the jobs. I mean, I don't know how OSHA gets funded, but people that get hurt in the job and the companies can't pay, or people that get fired, wrongfully fired, and then the state has to pay them while they sue the company and that sort of thing. So different states have different ways that they fund those programs that protect employees. Now, in addition to paying, their payroll, you may have to pay workers' compensation. Some industries in some states have to have workers' compensation. In Florida, for example, every company, every industry has to have workers' compensation once you have 4 employees or more. So a lot of companies try to stay within the 3-employee mark to avoid that. But in some cases, it's just not worth it. You got to get that extra employee. You got to pay workers' comp. So every time you add another employee, they'll be added to the workers' comp. Then you got employee benefits. In order for you to have an employee benefit like health insurance or 401k, they have to be non-discriminative. So once you give access to that benefit to one employee, like let's say the owners want to get a pension plan and they want a 401k and they want a health insurance, the owners can't discriminate with the other employees, and they have to make it available to every employee. So that will add on to that cost every time you add a new employee. So that's a really important point. In some cases, if you have employees, not contractors, employees that live in other states, you may have nexus, and that's a huge issue because if you got a company in California, for example, and they have a contractor, let's say in Ohio, I'm just going to name it out there. I don't know the rules in Ohio or California. You may not have to file state tax or income taxes in Ohio just by having a short-term contractor. But I'm sure that the California laws force you, or let's say California and New York. Let's say you have an employee in California and also employees in New York. I am sure that New York somewhere says, hey, if you got an employee here, you got nexus here, which also means you may have to file a state tax return, a state income tax return, and you may also have to deal with sales tax. So in those cases with multi-state, small businesses want to stay away from having employees in other states. And in most cases, if you got people in other states and you go back to the rules and figure out the behavioral control and all that stuff, financial, behavioral, relationship control, it is possible that you can have a subcontractor, especially if they're in another state where they don't step foot in your office and that sort of thing. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind. A lot of people don't think about that. Between workers' comp, taxes, all these additional burdens, I've seen anywhere between 8% to 25% as the actual additional out-of-pocket cost to the employers of having employees. Again, I'm not saying that you should have subcontractors in order to avoid all these expenses. I'm just saying this is a reality. These burdens exist, and this is why some people could be encouraged to potentially misclassify their employees as subcontractors. Now, there's also what I call the drama of having employees, dealing with all the human resource part, right? Sexual harassment, people mistreating each other, wrongful termination. In a lot of cases, you need to have an actual manager to manage the staff, manage the time that they come in, manage the work. If you had employees, it's a bunch of drama behind it. So a lot of people just want to avoid that and having independent contractors instead. Okay, let's talk about now the pros and cons and kind of the summary of an independent contractor. So usually independent contractors will not receive any employee benefits. So for the most part, there won't be an additional, let's call it payroll cost or benefit cost to the company. Administratively speaking, it's very easily, all you have to do is get an invoice, pay the amount, file a 1099 at the end of the year. Very important, since contractors are short-term in nature, because it's a contract, firing them or getting rid of them or replacing them is typically pretty easy because the contract ends. When terminating employees in certain states may have specific rules and regulations, okay? And the other challenge you're gonna have is independent contractors, typically because they don't have to abide by a schedule, they have to use their own tools, they cannot get specific training on how to do the work. In some cases, you will find that independent contractors cannot give the same quality of work that an employee can, just because it's much harder to quote unquote manage them. And if anyone's ever dealt with contractors of any sort, and the stigma behind contractors, you know exactly what I mean by that. So those are kind of like the pros and cons of that.